His name, or a name close enough to the 100 men like him, was Battista. He kept a wheel of Pecorino aging in a stone cellar cut straight into the hillside above his village in the Nuoro Mountains, the same cellar his father had used, the same cellar his father's father had used before that. Every morning for more than 70 years, he walked the same steep goat path to check on his flock. He had outlived his wife. He had outlived his brothers. He had outlived nearly every man who once worked those same hills beside him. And that, statistically, should not have happened, because in nearly every population on Earth, men lose that race early. Women outlive them by a wide margin everywhere, in every country, in every era we have reliable data for. Except here. This is an illustrative composite drawn from the pattern researchers have spent 2 decades documenting in Sardinia's mountain villages, not one identified individual. But the pattern he represents is real, and it is strange enough that it took a team of demographers years to confirm it wasn't a mistake. In 2004, a researcher named Michel Poulain, working with Giovanni Pes and a team of Italian colleagues, published a study called the AKEA Project. They found that Sardinia had 16.6 centenarians per 100,000 people, compared with a European average of 10 per 100,000. That gap alone was notable, but the number underneath it was the one that stopped them. Almost everywhere on Earth, the ratio of female centenarians to male centenarians runs around 5 to 1. In the mountain villages of central Sardinia, that ratio dropped to roughly 2 to 1. In some later analysis using national census data, researchers found a ratio of 2.5 to 1, still less than half the gap seen in the rest of Italy. The team didn't just trust the number. They went back to the civil registries, town by town, and checked the birth and death records themselves. The ages held up. This wasn't a record-keeping error. Something in this specific place was rescuing the sex that almost always dies first. The researchers were careful about what they claimed. They didn't say they'd found the cause. What they said, in their own discussion of the findings, was that the effect was unlikely to be explained by genetics alone, and that lifestyle and behavioral factors were probably interacting with whatever genetic isolation existed in these mountain communities, isolation built up over generations of limited migration and intermarriage within small villages. Genetics may set the stage, but something else was pulling the trigger, and when you look at what these villages were actually eating, decade after decade, a pattern starts to explain a meaningful piece of it. The first layer of that pattern is the simplest, and it's the one most people already half know, even if they've never taken it seriously. The traditional Sardinian plate was built around legumes, whole grains, and garden vegetables, with meat reserved largely for Sundays and special occasions, not for daily eating. Fava beans, chickpeas, lentils, whatever grew in the garden that season, cooked slowly, dressed with oil, eaten as the center of the meal rather than the side dish. Meat and fish combined made up a small fraction of weekly intake. This wasn't a diet in the sense of a chosen program. It was simply what the land gave and what a shepherd's household could afford to eat every day. Here's why that matters at a biological level. Chronic, daily, high intake of animal protein keeps certain growth and inflammatory signaling pathways in the body running hot year after year. That signaling is useful when you're young and your body is still being built. Kept elevated for decades in an adult, it's associated with faster cellular wear. A plant-forward plate, heavy in legumes and whole vegetables, keeps that signaling lower, and it delivers its energy slowly, through fiber-buffered carbohydrates rather than sharp spikes. The Sardinian shepherd wasn't managing his insulin response on purpose. He was eating beans because that's what the garden and the flock allowed, several times a week, for his entire life. So here is the first concrete action, and it costs nothing extra to try this week. Build your next lunch around a legume and vegetable dish first as the main event, not the side dish. Chickpeas, lentils, fava beans, whatever you already have. Let meat become the occasional addition to the meal, not its center. That's tier 1. It's not dramatic. It's also exactly what the data traces back to. The second layer is the one people get wrong, because it looks like it shouldn't belong in a longevity diet at all. Pecorino, a fatty, salted, aged sheep's milk cheese, eaten regularly in these same villages, sitting right alongside all that plant-forward eating. If you've absorbed the usual wellness messaging, your instinct is to assume this is the piece of the diet you should quietly ignore, or the exception that proves the rule. That instinct is wrong, and the reason has to do with what the sheep were eating, not just what the cheese is. Multiple peer-reviewed feeding studies on dairy ewes have found that pasture and grass feeding directly raises the concentration of conjugated linoleic acid, known as CLA, and omega-3 fatty acids in the milk fat those sheep produce. One review of commercial cheeses found that sheep milk cheese carried a meaningfully higher CLA concentration than cow or goat milk cheese from the same region. A separate multi-year study conducted across several Italian universities in partnership with researchers in the United States confirmed that Pecorino Romano carries substantial levels of both CLA and omega-3 fatty acids, and traced that concentration specifically to how much fresh pasture grass the sheep were eating, rather than to any additive or processing step. In the literature, CLA is associated with anti-inflammatory activity, with support for cardiovascular health, and with anti-tumor and immune-modulating properties documented in laboratory and some human research. None of this means the cheese is a treatment for any disease. It means the fat in this specific cheese from these specific sheep is not behaving like the fat most people picture when they hear the word cheese. There's a detail that matters here almost as much as the chemistry, and it's the portion. In these villages, pecorino was never eaten as a snack food in the American sense, a block consumed on its own between meals. It was a small daily addition, a shaving over beans, a sliver alongside bread, folded into a meal that was still built primarily around plants. The dose in the tradition is modest. That's not an incidental detail, it's most of the point. So the second concrete action, if you're going to bring a hard sheep's milk cheese into your own kitchen, look specifically for pasture-raised or grass-fed labeling, since that's the feeding pattern the research consistently ties to higher CLA and omega-3 content, and treat it the way the tradition does, a small portion folded into a plant-forward meal, not eaten as a standalone snack. Now here's where the two separate lines of research, the demographic data and the dietary data, actually meet, and it's worth sitting with this for a moment because it's rare for two completely different kinds of study to point at the same place. The AKEA demographers were tracking birth and death records, building genealogies, mapping which villages produced the most male centenarians. They weren't nutrition researchers. Separately, food historians and public health researchers were documenting how the Sardinian diet had changed since the 1950s, watching the traditional, low-calorie, plant-dominant pattern get gradually replaced in younger generations with more calories, more meat, more processed bread, more oil. Two different research traditions, two different sets of methods, two different decades of publication, and they converge on the same shape. The oldest people, the ones who lived the traditional pattern the longest and the most completely, are also the ones the demographers were finding in the mountain villages where the sex ratio anomaly was strongest. The researchers themselves were careful not to claim this proves causation. Population studies like these cannot isolate diet as the single variable responsible for the longevity itself. But when a geographic longevity anomaly and a documented dietary shift point in the same direction at the same populations across independent research groups, that's not nothing. That's the kind of convergence that makes a pattern worth taking seriously, even without a randomized trial to nail down the mechanism completely. Which brings us to the third layer, the one that's easiest to overlook because it isn't really a food at all. It's a structure. The traditional Sardinian meal wasn't built the way a modern multi-course meal is built, with a starter, a main, and a side. According to researchers, including Dr. Luca Diana, a professor of clinical biochemistry who has studied these communities directly, the tradition was a single dish, mostly vegetable-based, with a small component of protein folded in, eaten in a household where nobody was measuring calories or macronutrients. It was, in the language used to describe it, remarkably frugal. Portion size and course structure were doing quiet, invisible work that nobody in that generation would have described using the word portion size. This matters because you can eat all the right individual foods and still undercut their benefit if the meal itself has no natural ceiling. A single vegetable-forward dish, eaten until you're comfortably satisfied rather than full, does something that a modern plate loaded with multiple rich courses simply doesn't do. It keeps the caloric load consistent and moderate, meal after meal for decades, without anyone having to think about it as a rule. Third concrete action: build one meal a day, just one to start, as a single vegetable-forward dish, rather than multiple separate courses stacked on top of each other. Eat until you're comfortably satisfied, not until the plate is empty out of habit. That's the whole instruction. It isn't a diet, it's a shape. Let's bring all three layers back to Batista, standing on that goat path, in a village where the usual rules about who outlives whom simply don't apply the way they do everywhere else. He never called any of this a system. He never counted grams of CLA or thought about insulin signaling. He ate beans because that's what the garden gave him. He ate a sliver of pecorino because that's what the flock gave him. He ate one dish at a time because that's simply how a meal was built in that house, going back further than anyone could tell him. The research didn't create this pattern. It found a pattern that was already there, sitting quietly in kitchens that never thought of themselves as doing anything remarkable. Here's the one thing to actually do today, before this becomes another video you watched and agreed with and then forgot. Build tonight's dinner as a single vegetable-forward dish. Legumes as the center, a small shaving of a real pasture-raised hard cheese folded in if you have it. Meat left for another day. That's Tier 1 and Tier 2 and Tier 3 on one plate tonight. If you want the full 90-day breakdown of how this pattern and the other blue zone systems translate into a week-by-week structure for an ordinary kitchen, the old world table protocol walks through exactly that, zone by zone, with shopping lists built for a regular supermarket rather than a specialty store. It's linked below if you want to go deeper than one video can take you. Subscribe to Old World Table. Every week, one zone, one system, one habit worth taking seriously. And tell me in the comments, what's the one old-fashioned food from your own family's table that you never thought of as healthy until just now? I read every one of them, and the best answers shape where we go next.